Welcome to Architects of Imagination, a game dev podcast where we talk to the brilliant minds behind your favorite video games. And it's my pleasure today to introduce my friend, Mr. Stuart Moulder. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi, DJ.
Before I sort of introduce, how I met you and when we worked together back in the day, why don't you give us a little introduction of yourself? Where did you start in video games? What are some of the major titles that you've worked on? Tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I joined the games industry in 1991, literally the day after New Year's, 1991, at Sierra Online, where they were at the time one of the top companies, and they mostly made mystery adventure games, puzzle games. And when I joined with no experience in the games industry, I joined as a producer. There were only two of us there, and my job was basically to try and get games done and out the door. And I wound up being given the first CD-ROM game that ever shipped, a game called Mix of Mother Goose by Roberta Williams, who was the co-founder of the company. Anyway, I worked there for a couple of years. Probably the coolest thing I did there was actually working on an online gaming network called the Imagination Network. This was pre-internet days, so it was actually a much harder thing to do than it would be today. And we had some success, and we were actually bought by AT&T of all companies. And when that happened, I decided I wanted to maybe go somewhere else because I didn't want to work for AT&T. And through a lot of weird coincidences and the like, I wound up at Microsoft, where they were trying to build up a games group, and they had about 25 people in the whole company focused on games. And I joined them. They had Flight Simulator and not much else. During my time there, I signed Age of Empires. That was our first million-selling hardcore gamer game. And I love the game, but beyond that, it was really important because it helped Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer believe that Microsoft could actually be a player in the space, because we'd actually had some commercial success in the space with that game. And so that, in combination with Alex St. John's team doing DirectX, kind of in combination, gave Bill and Steve the ability, if you will, to place a bet and make the Xbox. Then as part of that, we went out looking for Xbox games, console games, and I wound up being a driver in the acquisition of Bungie Studios, the makers of Halo. And so that was probably the second feather in my cap, right? The first was Age, and the second is Halo. And I, to this day, I love Bungie. I loved Halo as a game player as much as anything else. Without them, I don't know what would have happened to Xbox. But on a personal level, I love the game. I co-opted it with my, at the time, 6-year-old son, which was completely inappropriate, but we had blast.
That is a scary game for a 6-year-old.
He loved that we're doing it together. And you know what's weird? It's aliens. So weird. So they're kind of scary, but they're aliens, right? It's not zombies. And it wasn't until the flood came along, then you did kind of get some of that scary stuff. But by then, I'd kind of hardened him, and he could handle it. So those were really my two biggest claim to fame. And I was there for about 10 years. And then I left. I really wanted to do more casual, family-oriented stuff, and I kind of kicked around doing that for a number of years. And wound up ultimately kind of coming back to more hardcore gaming groups with a game company called Wargaming. Does a game called World of Tanks. I was with them in their U.S. studio, and then they shut that down a few years ago, just before COVID. And in the meantime, I'd met some people, and I have not been in the industry except in an advisory role for the last several years, where I do some work with DigiPen. So my big claims to fame, I'll argue, still are Age of Empires and the Halo games.
Awesome. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of life after the games industry a little bit, but a couple other notable things in your career that I have fond memories of too. Looking at your Moby games, Rise of Nations was another title that you were on.
Yes, with Brian Reynolds and that crew. Absolutely. Yeah.
That was a phenomenal RTS game. I was pretty addicted to it for a long time. It was innovative in a space that it was kind of uniquely innovative. Like I remember the mechanics of having a deck of cards that would modify the opening conditions of the game. I thought it was brilliant. I really loved that. And there's a few games like that over time that I really held on to, like, genre bashing and Chrome Hounds is another one I think of that, like the sort of Risk battle map style that kind of changed how I think of like games entirely. So yeah, that was an awesome. Do you have any memories from your
Well,
time
yeah.
on?
So I love, yeah. Rise of Nations is a great one. Um, so the irony there, um, one of my favorite games was Civilization, Sid Meier's Civilization, and then they made Civilization 2. Well, Brian Reynolds was actually the person who made Civilization 2. It wasn't Sid Meier.
Oh
And
wow.
and if you go look, you can tell, oh wait, he was the designer, the lead developer. I mean, he back in the day when you could do all those things, he did those things. He's kind of like our friend Travis, right? He couldn't do everything. Brian couldn't do art. Travis could do art. Brian couldn't do art. But Brian was a great game designer and a great programmer. He switched more and more to just design. But the irony to me was when we did Age, I used to call Age a cross between Civilization and Warcraft, and it was an okay description, but people who really like Civilization kind of got mad about it because it didn't have the rich technological tech tree complexity of Civilization, right? It was an RTS. And so people were like, well, it's really more like Warcraft with sort of history clothes thrown over it. And it's whatever. Then Brian leaves Firaxis, where he'd gone with Sid after Microprose, and to make his own company. And they pitch Rise of Nations. And Rise of Nations is, in a way, the true Civilization meets Warcraft game. It is a richer tech tree. It is a richer strategic game. It is more true to the Civilization gameplay and archetype than Age was. Age really was pretty much Warcraft with a little more depth and history in it. Rise was really that blend, and I think they hit it out of the ballpark in so doing.
Yeah, that was an amazing one. So, Age of Empires, you were there sort of in the beginning, and they've now remastered some of the later ones and
Yeah,
come out with the sort of the new Age of Empires. Have you played it? What do you think of the new
I
stuff?
have. And it's funny. Part of my problem is I don't have as now that I'm not in the industry, I don't have as much time to play. Um, I thought they did some nice things, to kind of evolve and deal with some of the micromanagement in a little more elegant way. And I thought the game was fluid and fun. Um, and I have nothing bad to say about the game, and yet I have to admit it didn't grab me. And I think this is the thing about games: when you find the right game, it grabs you, it compels you. It is a little bit of an addiction, maybe a lot of it, and you just have to keep playing. And it's pleasurable to do so, right? It's not addiction like you're not getting, and that's bad sense, and addiction in a good sense. I think the first age had that. I think the second age had it even more. I think Halo has had that. We could argue about the later versions, but certainly the first few versions did. Um, the best Call of Duty games had that, right? But the latest age was fine, but it didn't grab me, and be I cannot say why that was. I don't know if it was because it was just too much like the same thing again, but nicer, or if there was something else missing there for me. But it was fine and fun, and I spent some time over the first weekend playing it, but I've never gone back to it. I've never felt compelled in that way.
Yeah, I had a similar experience too. I dove in. I really dug the like production values of it. Like they hired a film crew to to like
Mhm.
go on
Right.
location to the now ancient ruins of these places. I thought that was pretty brilliant. But yeah, the gameplay itself, like, yeah, I maybe gave it a couple nights and like it just didn't like suck my brain in the way the older ones
Right.
did.
Right.
Uh,
I don't know if that's a sign that we're older and somehow things have moved past our days.
yeah.
I do think there was something missing there. What's funny, what makes me feel a little bit um, disappointed in myself is that I can't put a finger on it. Um, One of my favorite topics in talking to my teams over the years has been how to deliver criticism, um, because most people in the industry do it very poorly, and
Yeah.
consequently, it just creates hurt feelings and doesn't necessarily propel a game in the right direction. So what and the to cut to the chase on that is basically be really specific about whatever your feedback is. Because if you're not, if you just say that sucked, you're not.
That's not helpful.
There's no actionable, isn't it? What am I going to do with that? Thanks. You don't like chocolate. I like, I mean, what am I going to do with that, right? But if it's like, let's talk about the new age, it's not really the case. But if it was too slow and its pace, um, and this actually happened in the development of Age 2. When we created the sequel to Age of Empires 1, the first iterations of the new age were slower paced. They had a deeper, richer strategic element, but they were slower. And in so doing, they lost the fun of the first game. And we realized that and
Interesting.
we made a pivot, right? But as we sat down, it wasn't enough to say, I don't like it or it sucks. We had to like, what's going on here? What is not working here? And we had to dig a little deeper and figure out this is what's going on. Now, how do we address it? So with the
Yeah,
new age, I wish I could tell them this is where it went wrong for me, and I can't. I just isn't grabbing me, and I can't say exactly why.
yeah, it's a tricky thing to put a finger on, like just the subtle nuance of the feeling of gameplay, good versus
Yep.
not quite good
Yeah.
gameplay. Like how do it really is, it's often, some guy with a touch of genius in there, just like, you know, just
I'll, t-
turning knobs over and over
I'll,
again. It's
I'll tell you what Ensemble did in their culture that definitely contributed, I think, to their success. They drove to get something playable as early as possible, however primitive it was, and then every single afternoon the team stopped. Everybody, not just the programmers or the designers, but the artists, the musicians, everybody, and they played that thing for as long as they could, either a complete game or till it crashed and burned because early days of development. But they
yeah,
pushed on it from a gameplay point of view every single night. That was baked into the culture, right? Like the way other peoples would do scrums and they'd have their, little scrum rituals. And someone did a little of that, but the biggest thing I think they did that really mattered in how the games turned out was that they never once skipped the ritual of playing the dang thing in its latest iteration. And from that, developing a feel and moving in a different direction. Or oftentimes there's a punch list. Well, let's try these 5 things, 4 of which failed. That's fine. But they kept iterating at a tremendous rate. And that, I think, was a big part of why those games turned out the way they did.
yeah. And like when you're in a studio and that's happening, like my equivalent of that, I think, would be Shadowrun, where we played it. I think it was every night, and
Yeah.
like, yeah, you just you have to eat your own medicine,
Yeah.
right? You gotta feel where it's painful, and yeah, just it really does help advance things and make them feel better over time. Yeah, that's huge.
Anyway,
I want to take us
that's me. Go ahead.
I want to take us back a step to when you and I met. We both worked at Wild Tangent
Yep.
together under Alex St. John.
Yep.
And if it's okay, I've got a bit of a funny anecdote for the day and moment we met.
Okay, go ahead. I'm a little scared, but go ahead.
So I remember it's yeah, I don't know. It cracks me. I've told the story a few times. I find it funny. Um, I remember you came Monday, you started work and we did the company meeting, and Alex, here's Stuart, he's sort of the head
Mhm.
of production, game development at Wild Tangent. And my boss, who at the time, Dave Sully, who reported to you,
Yeah, yep.
I remember he running into me in the halls before lunch. He was like, "Hey DJ, I need to talk to you after lunch. Come to my office and we'll chat." Yeah, sure, sounds good. Went to lunch, came back, ran into him again. He's like, "All right, come in, let's chat." And I go in there, and you're in his office, and he introduced us. "Hey, I'm DJ. Welcome to the company. Hope glad to have you here." And you guys told me to sit down. And I remember the conversation was, I don't know if you remember this.
I don't.
And we can edit this out too, by the way, if you don't want
No,
this
no,
story
that's
here.
okay. That's okay.
Someone had reported that I was smoking weed at the office.
Oh my gosh. I don't remember this. Gosh, how do I not
Yeah.
remember this?
And you
See,
guys,
if it's Blizzard, you would have been running lines of Coke, right? See, his same stuff with all tangent.
what's going on there? Hell yeah. and like it was a funny moment because in the end, you know, like okay, what you do on your own time is your own business, and but you can't do, you know, you have to come to work sober, and yeah, and at the end, you guys were like, "Do you have a response?" And my response was like, "Yeah, I'm kind of confused because I don't smoke weed."
At
So
all. That's
in
hilarious.
my head, like I'm
Well,
thinking of like,
I
you know,
just
half
trying to
of the art
understand why
maybe.
this was a day one conversation. Like, did Alex grab me or somebody else
You know,
say, hey,
I know there was like, I think HR, the sort of like stance of HR around that time. I remember there were one or two other things going on around then where like whenever like a thing got reported to HR, like it was, I don't know, through legal or HR, but it had to be addressed, right? That there had to be a talking to with the
yeah, I do
individuals.
remember the HR person being a really, maybe not the right personality for a games business. Let's just say that. Like she'd walked
Yeah,
right out of some bad movie about a high school with a terrible principal, and that was now our HR person. I remember her being just so like she walked out of IBM or something, just really,
yeah, very very buttoned up and by the book. Yeah, and to this day, like I don't like weed and never really have. And I was like genuinely confused by that. I had a dog that
I
I had a
can't
puppy in
think
the
what's
office I
funny.
was weaning.
I can't think of anyone in that office, and not just you. Like I can't think like why would this even have come up? Um, it wasn't really that
I
kind
think
of an
there were
office.
there were I mean, look, at any game development studio, you know, a good half of them are
Well,
you know,
that's the other thing.
there's
Like, do
plenty,
you really care? I mean, at the end of the day, what are you producing, right? And if it's good
yeah.
stuff, um, then do we really care, right? Um, and most game companies don't. Um, see, my funny twist on this, when I joined Sierra, um, not long after I joined Sierra, a book was published. I think it was Hackers by Steve Levy. And a large part of the book is devoted to the early days of Sierra Online in the 80s, because Sierra Online came into prominence with at the beginning of the Atari 2600 era. And, and they rode that wave pretty successfully and got pretty big. And Ken and everyone got pretty rich. And in the book, they detail what they did with that money, which is basically they had blowout, amazing parties full of, illicit drugs and everything else up there in the mountains, right? They'd dash down to Fresno or dash over to San Francisco and make their buys and come back and had
Oh
these
man.
blowout parties, right? And then the crash came in the mid midish 80s. It crashed. The whole thing just crashed. From Sierra barely survived, crawled out of that, not doing console games anymore, just PC games, and rebuilt. And by the time I joined, they were very successful again. But I got a little mad to find out that I'd missed all of that shit. By the time I joined there was none of that
What was going
happening.
on while you were
And
there?
some of those people who were there were part of it and had straightened up, right? Cleaned up, straightened up, were pretty boring, people. It was a fun company. There were great people there. But there was all of this wild, rock and roll stuff. I missed it. I 100% missed it. And then I'd
Oh
be
man.
up, working for Microsoft, which is not that kind of company, of course, but we were working with other game companies, and I'd hear stories about places, particularly in Southern California, and it'd be like, I don't want to do any of that stuff, but I'd like to be invited. I'd like to know I could be around it and see that, there's crazy ass shit going on I could tell stories about. But nope,
Yeah.
nope, no, not never happened. So, well, it's good. I guess I'm sorry about that. I don't know. It's a funny way to see. My memory, DJ, is totally different. You invited us to your apartment at one point. We played games one afternoon. That's what I remember. That was my favorite memory. We just hung out and played games, and that was cool. I
Hell
think my
yeah.
kid was with me, and we all played and had a good time.
Yeah, that was a magical time. And I think, you know, Age was one of the games on the roster around then
Mhm.
when we were playing, you know, Halo was getting played a
Mm.
lot, but like I love that time in
Mhm.
my life. It's one of the happier moments in memory. You know, Max and Brent and Radu, and
Oh
just
yeah.
all those guys are, I just love to death. There's a lot of Magic the Gathering going
Oh
on
yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
fighting games at the office. We just had so much damn fun.
Yeah. Yeah, which is how it should be. And I hope it was certainly true when, my last company, Wargaming, we were still having fun. There was stress. We'll probably talk about this more about the industry. There was stress because we understood that our studio was uh, we had to uh, we had to show what we had, and it had to convince the higher ups. And if that didn't work out, we might get shut down. And that is in fact ultimately what happened. But within that, we worked hard and we played hard, and people liked each other. Um, I've heard of studios where people had feuds and weird political shit, and I haven't had a lot of experience with that, I'm glad to say.
Yeah, I got to. It's an interesting like progression to like I did experience some of that. I think Infinity Ward eventually like it started out as one of the greatest companies and
Yeah,
experiences that I'd worked at, where Modern Warfare 2 was like 75 people, almost no crunch, critically
right.
acclaimed, fucking royal, everything's great. And then fast forward a few games, and half the team had left, and new people had gotten
Right.
put in charge, and like, yeah, and when a lot of money's involved too, people jockey for position and try to get other people fired, and it gets messy.
Money messes
And I
up,
think,
scale messes it up. When you start to get past a certain number of people, it's hard to have the same feeling. When you start bringing in a ton of outsourcing, and which you kind of had to, it's not a bad thing necessarily, but again, it's hard to have that feeling of intimacy when a significant amount of the content is coming from companies that you barely know, right? And so it's and so those are challenges. But they've been challenges for a while now, and companies try and figure out how do I still maintain. The thing that's been interesting to me for a long time in the early aughts, I think the trend was everything was just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then somewhere
yeah,
in the tens, people realized, hey, you know what? These small pixel games are still cool. People still like them. They'll still play them, and they'll pay money for them. And I can make that with a handful of people and kind of go back to the I'm just having fun making what I want to make. And if you're
yeah,
only supporting 6 to 12 people, it's okay if it didn't clear $1 billion. It doesn't need to, right? So there's some of that spirit still there. It's the industry's gotten so big, there's room for everything. But there is definitely going to be always, I think, an appetite for those huge blockbuster titles, and those take the scale of teams and the spend of money that make keeping the spirit of fun a little challenging. Yeah,
yeah.
and
And I've noticed a trend too for the sort of like mid small team,
yeah,
I guess I would put it, where they're like, back in the day, all game teams were tiny,
yep,
5, 10 people, and then it went to tens and hundreds, and now the mega blockbusters are 1,000 plus people on them, right? And in the last 8 or so years, I've seen more and more of the 35 to 65
mhm,
person team, where they're just trying to take like people they like that they used to work with, like there's layoffs or a branch off of a big company somewhere, and they'll just take almost entirely like seniors and leads, trusted people that are known and proven that kick ass, and then kind of supplement like the bulk of the work with outsourcing. You we talked about a little before the sort of the games industry transforming to the Hollywood gig
yeah.
model a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
So it's funny. So the games industry was born out of software, the software industry, and that's where I came from. And the software industry ethos was entrepreneurial and kind of in trail of that employment. And the idea was in software, and it worked. You would start with something like Apple with two guys in a garage, right? And if it was a good idea and it tickled investors and you could turn it into something that consumers loved, then it grew. And you would hire people, and those people you would give a share of that thing. You would give them share of the company so that they would share in your success. And the path to riches was in this shared um, pool of stock, right? That everybody had a piece of, and that worked for Apple, and it worked for Microsoft, and it worked for lots of people. Um, Hollywood's model was that you actually had you had these studios that act like publishers. Basically, they had the ability to release things into the theater, and they had the money to fund a film project. And then you had small groups that would go out, usually a producer and a director and a writer, and or a producer director and some talent, and would come up with something that they wanted to pitch. And if they're successful, they get funded, and then they would hire people to make that production, and they were only there for the production. Right, it was a gig.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons Hollywood was sometimes messed up was that people, once they got a gig, didn't care so much about how good they did on that gig as they did figuring out what their next gig was, so they had someplace to land next. So a lot of the energy was diffused from what you should be working on to what am I going to be doing next to feed my family. Anyway, so I didn't. I when I first came into contact with Hollywood in the '90s as part of the software industry, I thought that's crazy. I don't love that. And the people who tended to get rich were the very small number of people, the producer, writer, director, the talent that could get a piece, and everyone else just got a check. And there was no long-term
Yeah.
payoff. The residuals were only for a very, very small number of people. So I thought that was all horrible. But there were structures created like guilds for the professionals that gave them a certain amount of a safety net, gave them a certain amount of protection in negotiating with the studios, gave them good rules to work by so they couldn't be abused the way they once had been. And so things have evolved, and it's hard to imagine that you could make any modern movie any other way. You could not afford to have the thousands of people necessary, right? They'd have to be highly targeted, skilled companies brought in to solve a particular slice of the production problem, right? So now you look at games and you go, well, why do I say this about games? Why do I think maybe it's going that way? Well, look what's happening. Game companies during COVID times saw a ton of growth, and they hired a bunch of people to ramp up production. And then when it leveled off, when the growth leveled off, which everyone should have really foreseen was going to happen, when the outdoors opens up, some people will go back outdoors. They will spend their time and
Yeah.
money in some different ways when they are not forced to be inside and they don't have a lot of choices. So what happens? Well, you've got these employees, and you no longer have the revenue to justify it, and so you cut them, right? And we can talk about the moral aspect of that, I suppose, but the reality is, from a business point of view, is all unfortunately kind of predictable. Now it's turning into a little bit of a bloodletting because I do think we're going through not just the initial, okay, I need to actually trim back to meet where the revenue is really at. I was here and I need to bring it in. But now I'm looking forward and thinking, I don't think I want to be caught like this again. I don't think I want to be carrying just exactly as much headcount as I can afford to with the revenue. So I think maybe I'm going to go a little bit deeper and see how little I can get away with in terms of a steady burn rate or employment. And then I'm going to figure out how to fill in the gaps, and that those gaps will be filled. They'll be filled by people who are now unemployed, who come back either as contractors or as part of a company like yours or another company to fill in the production gap that does need to be filled in, but it won't be as employees. So I think the next thing to happen, and we're starting to see it, people talk about unionization. I prefer to talk about guilds. I don't know why. But it's the same idea. I think people of a similar skill set are going to need to come together in the games world and um, and have that organizational voice so that when they get brought in to do this work again, and they will be, that they are treated properly and that they're paid properly and that they're not put into situations that are untenable. And because that's what happened in the movie industry back in the day, and the guilds came along to basically fight for the rights of writers and fight for the rights of directors, producers, and actors, and so on and so forth. I think the same thing is going to happen in the games business because we're not going to see, I don't think we're ever going to see a return to the same employment levels. I think we're going to see more and more of the industry is going to be done through gig style work, through outsourcing work. That's just how it is. And so people come in the industry, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think you want to plan for that, think about that, and think about how do I protect myself? How do I get myself into a good position? Because it turns out employment felt like a secure place to be until you got laid off. And then you got nothing. You have, if
Yeah.
you're lucky, a couple months of severance, and then there you are, right? So people like me, dinosaurs, I think, have had to wake up, and hopefully younger people understand this. It's not the same, and it's never gonna be the same. It's not gonna go back to where it was, where everybody's working for a game company. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was surprising to me. Like one thing I didn't see coming too is that unionization in games would begin with QA.
Well, yeah, arguably,
There's been a
and I would argue they needed it the most. The
yeah,
hours
I
QA
think
was
so.
asked to run in response to poorly led, managed, planned, however you want to call it, uh, production schedules, um, is was a chronic issue. I don't,
Yeah,
and I'm not proud of this. I know I would go home and QA would still be there many times. And sometimes they
yeah.
did it themselves. They were young, they were enthusiastic, and blah blah blah. But you know what? Then it's the job of their managers to stop it and say, you know what? Actually, I need you to go home. I need you to be fresh tomorrow. I don't need you to be here till 11 grinding away because in the long run, it's counterproductive.
Yeah, I've taken a bit of maybe a radical stance on this topic in that I have invited my employees to unionize uh, internally, and part of why is I am one of the founding principles of our company anyway was I've worked crazy hours and no days off and slept at work and part of me leaving big AAA and starting my own company was like my wife was worried about my health.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like she's like, you're not gonna survive another one of these. She's like, you are so stressed out. um so one of our founding principles was to do it differently, do it better, treat our employees such that like if unionization would mean little to
mhm,
us and that we're already doing and giving them all of the things that
right,
they would be asking
right,
for in unionization. So, you know, making it meaningless to us, I think is speaks to the idea of, just treating employees ethically and healthfully to begin
yeah,
with. If you
yeah,
can, and I know there's structural reasons why big companies aren't like that, but as a small shop, we can ban crunch and give them siestas and a day off for their favorite video game
yeah,
and focus on mental health and all
yeah.
that stuff.
I think one reframing of it that may help people who are like, oh, unions, when your employees are in a union or a guild or whatever, one benefit for everybody is consistency. You know this thing of the past, and software companies were notorious for this, where certain types of employees um, were not treated the same way, were not paid the same way, or were treated in exactly the same way as they should have been. Not That's much harder to have that kind of BS go on if the employees are gathered together in a guild where it's like, hey, you've got to all be, I mean, by law and by our contract, you have to treat us consistently. Now, it's still crap
Yeah,
goes on, sure, but it is a step in that direction of, hey, you know what? You collectively, we're going to treat you in a consistent way, and hopefully in a nice, fair, and equitable and everything way as you were saying. But at least it's going to be consistent because that is something that definitely drives anybody nuts. The feeling that they're not being treated the same as everyone else doing the same job is a horrible feeling. You never want people to have that feeling. I'm going to offer up, as long as we were talking about crunching a little bit, I'm going to offer up a concept because I agree. Long term crunches, we've all been there. Um, are they're damaging to people and lives. They're ultimately counterproductive in that if they're sustained for any real length of time, it grinds you down and you do lower quality work or you make more mistakes and you have to spend more time making them up and you get into a bad spiral where you're crunching to make up for the fact that you were crunching. Um, and so that's
yeah,
not awesome. But we both remember times when we were heads down on a game and we were spending a lot of time on it, pushing for a deadline or pushing for ship. And I don't know what the rate duration is, if it's 2 weeks or 1 week or even maybe 4 weeks, but there's a short period of duration, and I call it intensity, not crunch, where you are doing some of that stuff, and it's okay because it's short lived, and what you are doing, and you can sustain for a very short period of time. You are ramping up your intensity and focus, where certain magical things can happen in that brief period of time before fatigue catches up to you and it all falls over. So there is
Yeah.
I call it intensity. That's the best word I could come up with for it. The other way to think about it is if you're going to run a mile, which at our age is actually kind of hard to even imagine, right? But if we were to run a mile, my son used to be a track guy, and his favorite part was the kick at the end. And the crucial thing about the kick at the end, he loved doing it, and it took every last bit of him out of him, and he almost fell over the finish line. But the crucial thing was you didn't start it too soon or too late. Like you did it for that last about quarter mile, maybe even a little less than that. Because if you tried to to do that, what I would call crunch at the half mile mark, you just die, right? You have your worst time
Yeah.
ever. And that's what crunch is. It's your worst results because you started that kick at an unsustainable place. But if you do a kick at the very end of a project or the very end of a milestone where it's all coming together, you can feel it, and the team is feeling it and wants to put that in for a few days to really bring it home, that I think there's something there that we don't have to lose. But you have to remember that track meet example. You start doing that. If you think you can sprint the whole time, you're wrong. You're wrong.
No. Yeah, you raise a good point. Like there's and it's our language is coarse for us. This we just call it
Yeah.
crunch, but like there are nuances and flavors of it, right? Like I think one big dividing line is whether or not it's
Yeah.
mandatory. Like if the company mandates you're
Yeah.
putting X extra hours a
Yeah.
day or X weekends in, then it's like it's veering into
Yeah.
abusive territory in my
Hmm.
mind. But there are crunch like it looks and smells like crunch, but if no one told you to, you're just there working late because you're
Right.
excited about a thing and your buddy's on it and you're going in and going hard. That's a different thing. That yeah, it looks and smells like crunch, but that's something else
Another
entirely, I
word is
think.
focus, right? And I kind of like that word because
Yeah.
you can, there's certain things you can only do when you have that singular focus and you have to follow it through. And the other reason I like that word is you cannot maintain that kind of focus for too long. Again, you can't do it for 6 months, right? You can do it over the weekend where you're like, you know what? This just hit me and I'm going to take this to the finish line because I got to, right? That's focus. Not like you say, it can't be mandatory and it can't be something that you think you can do for months or, you just can't. Then that's not focus anymore. That's just
Yeah.
grinding.
Um yeah, man. I'm happy to be in a no crunch place.
Sometimes, I mean, to be fair,
Before we
but
started,
we talk about crunch in the games industry. Probably the worst crunch I've ever heard of happened around Toy Story 2. I don't know if you know this story, but basically
uh
they lost everything. They lost the film, the backups, everything. They lost it. It was deleted. It's I forget whose book it is. It was one of the co-founders of Pixar, not Lasser, but the other guy who wrote about it. And so then they're like, well, we have a deadline and we have to basically do it over. And so, yeah, the whole team was crunching and doing crazy ass shit. And I could tell even in reading his story of it that he kind of regrets that instead of just saying, we just got to push it way out again, that they tried to hold to their original commitment despite this complete catastrophe. And I mean, I can't imagine, obviously, because it makes my stomach twinge just thinking about it. I mean, imagine that you were working on a game, right? And every file and backup somehow gets wiped. Like I think people just wouldn't come back. I don't think you'd have made it again. I mean, it says something about the Pixar culture that people are like, okay, I
okay.
guess we have to do it again. And I'm like,
No,
wow, good on you guys
oh
because
man.
I think I might have been broken. I might have been like, I can't even get up. I can't get
It's
out of
time to quit.
I can't do this. So anyway,
You were mentioning some pearls of wisdom before we started. Tell me more about that. What are some things you've been thinking
so one of them
about
is
in
the
regards to?
focus intensity idea, the idea that no, you shouldn't crunch, but there is some benefit. I really feel there's some tangible benefit to short bursts of really focused, intense activity. And honestly, I think
Yeah,
sometimes as an individual, but if you can get teams to be in that mode collectively and voluntarily, something does happen in those moments. Something emerges. The true soul of the game, if it's there to be found, will be found. Another pearl of wisdom is is more of a cynical observation. You've probably heard of the Peter principle. Everybody gets promoted past their level of competence. This is sort of like that. It's a little
yeah,
cynical, where I basically say it takes you when you're at 90% of your schedule, 90% complete, you're actually 50% complete.
yeah,
Like you're looking at your schedule and you're looking at your deliverables and you're like, I'm almost there. I'm about to enter beta and wrap this sucker up, slam dunk. And in my experience, it's actually 50% to 90% and 50% for the last 10%. If you're allowed. Now there are
yeah,
companies where like, well, they shoot you the middle finger and they ship it with only that extra 10%. And those are crappy games. That's often how you get a crappy game. In the case of Age of Empires, we really wanted to ship that game in Christmas of '96. And we had a shippable game in the fall of '96. Given what we shipped, you might not believe that's true, but it was true. It was a little buggy. The multiplayer was not particularly reliable, but it did work on lands at least. This is the early days of the internet, so that was starting to become more important, and our internet reliability was not good, so that was an issue. Our AI was even less than what it was when we shipped, let's just say that. But the shape of the game was there. You could play the whole game, you could play the campaigns, you could play multiplayer, uh, but it was the kind of game if we'd shipped it where people would have said, "Boy, that had a lot of potential," because it did. And we took a 6 month step back, and then we took another. So we took a full year step back before we shipped. And even then, it was a pretty hard push to get it to the end. But that extra time is what made it be able to be great. And it was still a flawed gem. There were still some significant flaws in what we ship, but it was a significantly better game, and it was the best game in its genre of that fall. There was that fall in '97. There were 25 games featured in PC Gaming World that were all RTSs. And
man.
Activision came out first with theirs called, I think, Dark Sky, something like that, and it failed. Beautiful, but it failed. And then we came out. Some others came out. Nobody noticed them. We came out, started to get some traction, not huge traction, because we ironically didn't build enough copies and we sold out because it's just
Oh
retail.
wow.
Yeah. Then Total Annihilation, Chris Taylor's game came out, and
Yeah,
people loved that game. It was a great game, but it had a cult
that was a hit.
following. It never became huge. Still kind of has a cult following, and we became the big game. But if we hadn't taken that whole extra year, which wound up being about, we took it was really about 1/3 more. We didn't double it. We did, you could say, we did 2/3 to get to 90% and 1/3 to do the last 10%. But the idea is, in a way, you can't fully understand and feel and grasp what you have until you get to that, I think I'm 90% done point. And at that point, a whole bunch of stuff is going to emerge that if you have the time and the willpower and the money to pursue it, can take that game to a whole nother level. And so I guess this is a message for producers and managers as much as anybody. Make your schedules, build out like you're going to go in this linear progression. It's a lie, but do that. But understand and be prepared if this game really has something going for it that you want to make a significant investment past the point where you think you're about done.
Yeah, yeah, and I've felt that in a way too. Like it's looking at games of different like length cycles, when at Wild Tangent, shit, we put a game out every like what 3 or 4 months with like 6 teams doing that, so we were cranking out not very good games.
But it was one. So it's
But
actually, I think, an illustration of the point. So Travis's game, right? Which now I miss
Torchlight.
No, before Torchlight, the one he did with us, the predecessor, Fable. Was it
Oh yeah,
Not Fable?
Fate.
Fate. Thank you.
Fate. Yeah,
Travis basically built 90% of that game on his own, right?
yeah.
And
A crazy fucking
right,
genius.
and he brought it in, and J-Min went out and got a bunch of outsource art to kind of fill it out, right? And we played and pounded on it, and there was some tuning Travis did. So the game, as he brought it in, was 90%, but it did need the vol. In his case, it was mostly a volume of assets that he needed, but
Yeah.
it was, there was more time put in that game than anything else Wild Tangent did, more resources and everything else. And shocker, it was, I think, by a very long stretch, the biggest, best thing we ever did.
Oh yeah,
When
100%.
we were there. It's hard, I say that like it's like glibly, like, well, it's easy to just go ahead and tack another year on or whatever. But if you're not making just an endless series of sequels where the scope's pretty well, if you're sitting there and you're trying to make something new that you want to have to have a big presence in the marketplace, then I think this 50/90 rule kind of is true. You should plan on that. You should plan on, if you really want it to be big, you're going to have to spend almost double what you expected to get it to be that good. And there's where I think games are maybe a little different than Hollywood. You can't really fix, you can do reshoots and the like, but it's really hard to fix a film that's only pretty good. Reshoots can maybe take it a little better, but it's very, very hard. Games, you can really be transformational. You can do some amazing stuff to a game, and then go to GDC and you can find out what people did that turned something that was kind of mediocre into something that was pretty awesome.
Hell yeah. And let me ask you this on that front too. Like, I just had a call with a guy a couple days ago, who new to the game industry. They just started a little team, and have never worked in games before, but they had a cool concept. Some of them were from film. The artwork was beautiful. I took a look at their trailer. The gameplay looked compelling too. It was kind of a platformer, sort of Ori and the Blind Forest vibes,
Nice.
a little bit. But they know nothing about the games industry, and he was scratching my brain a little bit on how does this work. They're in Germany, so they've got some government funding that'll get them a year in, but like for a new indie company that knows nothing about this, like how does it work? What is it like? You make a little prototype with your buddies, and then what? Like you take it to GDC or Gamescom and you pitch it and try to get an investor, get a publisher. What's your advice to him?
That would have been the old thing. Trying to get a booth at a convention or get an indie showcase would probably be appropriate for them. I feel like a lot of that stuff has moved online, and so it's like, what do you have to have now? Do you have to have like a TikTok reel that can catch somebody's eye? And I'm only being half facetious there, because I do feel like probably the more fruitful avenues might be to have a small piece of gameplay that you can put out there that people can actually experience. And if you're really good, you do it on mobile so that anybody walking around, which is everybody has a phone, right? So anybody that has some money has a phone, and you can zap this to them and say, hey, here's a 5-minute playable demo of our little piece of art. I think that ups your chances quite a bit, because before I left the games industry, one of the last things I did, I was CEO of a very small company, and I was pitching to investors. And it turns out you just have to pitch a lot. Like you have to have a good pitch, you have to have a good game in this case, good art and all that. But you just have to show it to a lot of eyeballs for the pair of eyeballs you need to catch sight of it and go, oh yeah, that's interesting to me. Let's talk. So I guess my advice to them would be, if you can distill it into a compelling 5 to 10 minute bit of gameplay that people could experience. And maybe it's actually a web app that they can experience on their phone. You make sure that it'll play on the browsers on people's phones, and then push it as far and wide as you can till hopefully up the odds that the right pair of eyeballs is going to encounter it and go, yeah. And there's other methods. People that I think Kickstarter's kind of dying down as a way to do this. People were playing with that for a while. I'm not sure that's
Yeah,
really the
there's
way anymore.
enough people getting burned with
Yeah,
that.
exactly. So I don't think that's particularly good. The best part when Kickstarter was working right, it was again another way for a lot of eyeballs to get a look at what you're doing. And maybe they give you money then, or maybe they give you money later, but at least you got exposure. And which is, at the end of
Yeah,
the day, that was,
it's
that's kind of the name of the game when you're unknown in the industry like these guys are, is how do you get exposure? How do you get eyeballs on it? Now, I'm going to argue for a little playable because that's where I'm from, right? Art shows are not enough, right? Unless they're that you're what you're doing. You've got to show people this is a compelling bit of fun gameplay here. And I'll give you another age example. When we were first showing Age of Empires in '95, um, all you could do, you had the little caveman in the Stone Age and his little fire in the clearing in the woods and deer, and you could hunt the deer and then you could cook them for food. Like you'd get the slabs, right? And then you'd come back to the fire. You didn't see them cooking, but it was implied, right? You could collect food. You could
yeah,
harvest deer. The visual look and feel was there. The gameplay control was there. And to this day, me and the two or three other people who were looking at it this early on were like, I don't know why, but that was like the most compelling thing. We sat there for like 30 minutes just hunting deer. Um, there was no battle really. But there was something there in that little nugget of gameplay they had that told us, yeah, these guys have got it. And it quickly evolved. A month later, yes, there was some battles and running around and building huts and stuff. But you could feel it right from the beginning in the little nugget of gameplay they had. And it helped a lot that their production design was this bright, cheerful world, which was very different. The aesthetic of the mid 90s was goth all the way. It was grays, browns, and
yeah.
blacks. And then suddenly you were in this world where you're like, you know what, I want to play in this world for a little while. I want to hang out. If I had a launcher, I'd just sit in it for a while.
Saturated
Yeah,
colors.
yeah, exactly. What the heck? Sunlight. Ah. So, one other, it's not really, I don't know if this is nugget anymore because I think people do this pretty naturally, but um, the biggest mistake we used to make in developing games is that we would make all the parts and then we would try and bolt them together near the end, and the whole thing just fell apart. It actually wouldn't work. And when it did work, it was like Frankenstein's monster, right? Arm from one person over here, another one over there, and dog leg
Yeah,
here and goat leg there. It was a mess. So Bungie actually did this with Halo 2, although they still had a hard production, but they did this one thing right. They said integrate early, build stubs, little bits and parts of all of the systems, and ram them together into a whole thing as early as possible. And there'll be a whole bunch of, this doesn't actually work yet, but it's bolted on. There's a structure here that's bolted on so that later when you filled it out, you already figured out architecturally how is this all actually going to work so that because when you wait in development too long and alpha is too long, way before that you should be doing this, then you're going to have the most ferocious set of delays that you didn't plan for, um, beyond what you can even fear, because it's just impossible with names as complex as they are to have these subsystems come together late. Now a lot of what we're doing is we're buying these subsystems. We're getting a physics engine over here and this, or we're buying the whole
yeah.
engine. So it's already pre-integrated. It's already all there. You get the Unreal Engine. It's already there. Then all you're doing is your little bits of add-ons. And again, I would still say bolt those in as early as you can, but it's not, I think it's quite as an existential issue as it used to be. But I can tell you many game projects were horribly delayed solely because of this one mistake that they made, which
Hmm.
was that they did not put it all together in some rudimentary fashion as early as possible in development.
Mr. Stuart Moulder, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, DJ.
Before we go, I'd like to thank my executive producer, Martika Ibarra, and the whole Architects of Imagination team. Till next time, we'll see you later.
Bye.